Story number 1. The Red Door. On the outskirts of Ravenswood, a town steeped in forgotten tragedies, stood a house that no one dared approach. The mansion, known as Thornhill House, had been abandoned for over 50 years. Its most peculiar feature was a vibrant red door, untouched by time. Despite the rest of the structure falling into decay, the door remained pristine, its paint vivid as fresh blood. Locals whispered about the family that once lived there, the Bellamys, who vanished overnight in 1971. Some said they had fled, others claimed they had been murdered, but those brave enough to get close to the property spoke of hearing strange sounds, footsteps, whispers, and faint cries for help. Enter Amelia, a freelance journalist with a penchant for debunking paranormal myths. She prided herself on her logical mind and had made a career out of exposing ghost stories as mere fabrications. Thornhill House was her latest project, and she intended to spend a night there to prove the legends were nothing more than small-town folklore. Amelia arrived at dusk, armed with a flashlight, her camera, and a notebook. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and gaping. The air was still, too still, as though the land itself held its breath. "Just another old house," she muttered, stepping through the rusted gate. The crunch of gravel beneath her boots echoed unnaturally loud. Reaching the porch, her eyes were drawn immediately to the red door. It looked freshly painted, gleaming even in the fading light. She touched it, half expecting wet paint, but it was dry and cold. Dismissing the oddity, she pushed the door open, its hinges groaning in protest. The interior was as decrepit as she expected. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs stretched across doorways like veils. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. She set up her camera in the grand foyer, where a once elegant chandelier hung lopsided. Hours passed uneventfully. Amelia explored the house, documenting its eerie beauty and dismissing the occasional creak of the floorboards as the groaning of an old structure. It wasn't until midnight that things began to change. She was in the dining room when she heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. She froze, her pulse quickening. It could be an animal, she reasoned. Squirrels, raccoons, anything but what the townsfolk claimed. "Hello," she called, her voice firm. The tapping stopped. With a deep breath, she climbed the grand staircase, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The upper floor was a maze of hallways and rooms, each darker and more oppressive than the last. As she walked, the tapping resumed, louder now, echoing from the end of the corridor. She followed the sound to a door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she found herself in a nursery. The room was unsettlingly preserved, as though the child who once lived there had only just left. A rocking horse sat in the corner, its paint peeling, and a crib stood in the center, draped in a moth-eaten blanket. On the floor lay a single toy, a red ball. As Amelia stepped closer, the ball rolled toward her, stopping at her feet. She stared, her breath catching. "That's not possible," she whispered. Then, from behind her, a voice. "Will you play with me?" Amelia spun around, her flashlight shaking. The hallway was empty, but the air had grown icy, her breath visible in the beam of light. Gathering her courage, she stepped back into the corridor, but something was wrong. The layout of the house had changed. The hallway stretched endlessly, its walls warped and pulsing as though alive. Doors appeared where there had been none, and whispers seeped from behind them, soft at first, then rising to a cacophony of desperate voices. "Turn back," one voice pleaded. "Stay," another hissed. Panicking, Amelia ran back toward the stairs, but they were gone. In their place was the red door, standing alone at the end of the corridor. It wasn't possible. She had entered through the door downstairs, and yet here it was, impossibly waiting for her. She approached cautiously, the whispers growing louder with each step. The door seemed to hum, as though alive, its surface unnervingly warm to the touch. She tried to turn back, but the hallway behind her had vanished. Darkness pressed in from all sides, forcing her toward the door. With no other choice, she gripped the handle and pulled it open. On the other side was a room that defied reason. It was vast, impossibly so, with walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic tang that stung her nostrils. At the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay a ledger. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in names written in spidery handwriting. She approached, drawn inexplicably to the book. Her own name was on the last page, written in fresh ink. A voice boomed from the shadows, deep and resonant. "You've been marked." Amelia turned, but the room was empty, or so she thought. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, figures with hollow eyes and twisted forms. They moved toward her, their whispers filling her mind. "Join us," they chanted. "It's your turn." She backed away, her heart pounding, but the figures closed in. The red door was still open, and she ran toward it, desperate to escape. As she crossed the threshold, she stumbled into the foyer, gasping for air. The house was silent again, the whispers gone. Amelia didn't wait to gather her equipment. She fled, slamming the red door behind her. But as she reached her car and looked back, she saw something that froze her blood. The red door was no longer part of the house. It stood alone on the lawn, open slightly, as if waiting for her to return. She never spoke of what happened that night. Her footage was corrupted, her notes incomplete. But something changed in her after that. An unshakable paranoia, a fear of doors, and a certainty that some places are meant to be left alone. Thornhill House still stands and the red door remains, waiting for the next curious soul to step through. Story number 2. The Man in the Yellow Raincoat. It started on a rainy Tuesday evening. Sarah had just finished her late shift at the diner and was walking home through the empty streets of her small town. The rain was relentless, soaking through her jacket despite her umbrella. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the glistening pavement. She first noticed him near the corner of Maple and Fifth, standing perfectly still under the weak glow of a street lamp. He wore a bright yellow raincoat, its hood pulled low over his face. Something about him made her uneasy. He didn't move, didn't gesture, just stood there, facing her direction. Sarah quickened her pace, her boots splashing through puddles. She glanced back, and the man was gone. A chill crept up her spine, but she told herself it was nothing. Probably just someone waiting for a ride. The next night, it rained again. Sarah left the diner at the same time, clutching her umbrella tightly as she walked the familiar route home. Near the same corner, she saw him again, the man in the yellow raincoat. This time, he wasn't standing still. He was walking, slowly, deliberately, in the same direction as her, but on the opposite side of the street. His head was slightly tilted, as if he were watching her from beneath his hood. Sarah's heart raced. She tried to convince herself it was a coincidence. Plenty of people wore raincoats, she thought, and maybe he just lived nearby. Still, she crossed the street, putting as much distance between them as possible. But as she reached her apartment building and fumbled for her keys, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. From the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a flash of yellow near the alley across the street. By the third night, the rain had become a storm. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Sarah closed the diner and stepped outside. She hesitated before taking her usual route home, her mind replaying the unsettling encounters from the nights before. Deciding not to chance it, she took a different path, one that wound through the busier, better-lit streets. It added 10 minutes to her walk, but she felt safer. Halfway home, she began to relax. The streets were empty, but the glow of shop signs and the occasional passing car gave her a sense of security. She laughed at herself for being so paranoid, and then she saw him. He was standing at the end of the block, directly under a flickering street lamp. The yellow of his raincoat was almost fluorescent in the dim light. This time, she didn't try to rationalize it. She turned and ran, her umbrella forgotten, rain pelting her face as her boots pounded against the pavement. She didn't stop until she reached her building, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it. From her window on the third floor, she peered out into the stormy night. For a moment, there was nothing but rain. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the street, and she saw him again, standing at the edge of the sidewalk looking up at her window. The next morning, Sarah told her friend and coworker Lisa about the man. "Maybe it's just some creep who thinks he's being funny," Lisa said. "You should report it to the police." Sarah nodded but didn't follow through. What could she tell them? A man in a raincoat was walking around. She doubted they'd take her seriously. That night, the rain stopped, but Sarah's anxiety didn't. She left the diner early, determined to get home before dark. As she walked, every shadow, every distant sound set her nerves on edge. When she reached her building, she paused before going inside, scanning the street for any sign of yellow. Seeing nothing, she hurried up to her apartment and locked the door behind her. She spent the night on edge, checking the locks repeatedly. But when morning came, she felt foolish. There had been no sign of him. Maybe it really had just been a coincidence. The following week passed uneventfully. The rain had cleared, and Sarah began to feel like herself again. She even started walking her old route home. The man in the yellow raincoat didn't appear, and she began to believe he was gone for good. But one night, as she was brushing her teeth, she heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was so soft she thought she imagined it, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from her bedroom window. Her stomach turned to ice. Slowly, she walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. There he was. The man in the yellow raincoat stood on the fire escape, his face still obscured by the hood. His hand was pressed against the glass, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. Sarah screamed and stumbled back, grabbing her phone to call the police. When she looked back at the window, he was gone. The police arrived within minutes but found no sign of anyone on the fire escape or in the alley below. They suggested it might have been a prank, though one officer stayed outside her building for the rest of the night. The next day, Sarah decided to stay with Lisa for a while. She couldn't bring herself to sleep in her apartment, not with the image of that raincoat burned into her mind. But even at Lisa's place, the nightmares followed. She dreamt of the man standing over her bed, water dripping from his raincoat, his face shrouded in darkness. She woke up gasping, the sound of tapping echoing in her ears. On the fourth night at Lisa's, Sarah woke to a strange noise. It wasn't the tapping this time. It was the sound of Lisa's front door creaking open. "Lisa!" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She crept out of bed, her heart pounding. The living room was empty, but the door was ajar, rain pooling on the floor beneath it. And on the doormat lay a single yellow raincoat, drenched and empty. Sarah was never seen again. To this day, the people of Ravenswood talk about the man in the yellow raincoat. Some say he only appears on rainy nights, following his victims until they vanish without a trace. Others believe he's not a man at all, but something much worse. An omen, a collector of souls. And if you see him, don't run. It only makes him follow you faster. Story number 3. The Watcher in the Woods. The small town of Gray's Hollow was surrounded by dense ancient woods that stretched for miles. The locals called it Blackthorn Forest, and they avoided it after sunset. It wasn't just the suffocating darkness or the chilling howls of wolves that kept people away. It was the stories, whispers of something lurking among the trees. Nobody knew what it was, but the tales were consistent. A figure with glowing eyes that appeared without sound, watching from the shadows. It never chased, never attacked, but its gaze left a mark. A lingering sense of dread, as though it had seen into your soul and found something wanting. Of course, teenagers loved to test their courage against the warnings. They would dare each other to spend a night in the forest, to go farther and stay longer than anyone before. Most returned shaken but unharmed, claiming they had seen nothing. But some never came back. One such teenager was Daniel Brooks, 18, confident, and determined to prove he wasn't afraid of anything. He had heard the stories all his life about the disappearances, the warnings carved into trees at the edge of the forest, the sightings of the Watcher. He dismissed it all as superstition. On a crisp autumn evening, Daniel and his two best friends, Mike and Ella, stood at the edge of Blackthorn Forest. The sky was painted with shades of orange and purple, the sun sinking behind the trees. "This is stupid," Ella said, hugging her jacket tighter against the cool air. "We could just watch a movie like normal people." "It's not stupid," Daniel shot back, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "It's an adventure. Besides, if we see anything, it'll be great for my blog." Mike smirked. "Yeah, nothing says great content like pissing yourself in the woods." Daniel ignored him and stepped into the forest. The others reluctantly followed, their flashlights cutting through the dimming light. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of leaves, faded until only their footsteps remained. The air grew colder, the trees denser, their twisted branches forming an oppressive canopy overhead. They reached a clearing where a large, moss-covered rock jutted out of the ground. Daniel declared it their campsite and began unpacking. Ella lit a small lantern, its warm glow casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. Hours passed uneventfully. They built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and laughed at Mike's terrible ghost stories. For a while, it felt like any other camping trip. Then, as the fire burned low, they heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes. Ella si congelò. What was that? Probably a deer, Daniel said, though he gripped his flashlight a little tighter. The rustling grew louder, closer, until it stopped just beyond the edge of the clearing. They shone their flashlights into the darkness, but saw nothing. Maybe we should head back, Ella whispered. We're fine, Daniel said, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. That's when they saw it. 2 pinpoints of light hovering in the shadows. They weren't reflections. They glowed with an unnatural amber hue. What the hell is that? Mike muttered, his voice barely audible. The lights didn't move, didn't blink. They simply stared, unyielding and unblinking. Probably an animal, Daniel said, though he didn't believe his own words. Then, without warning, the lights disappeared. The group sat in tense silence, straining to hear any sound. Minutes passed, then an hour, but the forest was unnaturally quiet. We're leaving, Ella said firmly, standing and grabbing her backpack. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the clearing. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was something inhuman, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The lights returned, closer this time, and they weren't alone. More pairs of glowing eyes appeared, surrounding the clearing. Run, Ella whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel grabbed his flashlight, and the 3 of them bolted into the trees. The underbrush clawed at their clothes and skin as they ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The eyes followed, always at the edge of the light, never approaching, but never falling behind. Which way is out? Mike shouted, panic rising in his voice. I don't know, Daniel yelled back, his breaths ragged. They stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive dead tree. Its bark was blackened, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. Carved into the trunk was a single word, leave. Before they could process the warning, the eyes reappeared, circling them. The group huddled together, their backs to the tree as the lights drew closer. Why aren't they attacking? Ella susurró. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face, or what passed for one, was blank, featureless except for a gaping void where its mouth should have been. The Watcher. It stepped into the clearing, its glowing eyes fixed on Daniel. The others froze, too terrified to move. The Watcher raised a spindly hand and pointed at him. No, Daniel muttered, shaking his head. No. The figure tilted its head, and the forest erupted with sound. Screams, whispers, cries of agony, all coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Daniel fell to his knees, clutching his head as the cacophony overwhelmed him. Ella and Mike pulled at him, shouting for him to move, but he was frozen in place. The Watcher loomed over him, its featureless face inches from his own. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, along with the eyes. The forest fell silent. Ella and Mike managed to drag Daniel back to the edge of the forest as dawn broke. He was pale and shaking, his eyes wide and unblinking. They never spoke of what happened that night, but Daniel was never the same. He stopped talking, stopped eating, and spent his days staring at nothing, his once vibrant personality replaced by a hollow shell. Months later, he disappeared. Ella and Mike never returned to Blackthorn Forest, but sometimes, late at night, Ella would dream of glowing eyes and hear a voice whispering from the darkness, "I'm still watching."